question of why God allows pain and suffering is central to the problem of evil, a theological and philosophical challenge that interrogates how a loving, omnipotent God can coexist with the reality of suffering. This issue affects both believers and skeptics, often intensifying during personal hardship, loss, or illness. A theology of divine consent, wrath, and love. In contemporary theological discussions, the concept of divine consent has emerged as a significant framework for understanding the interplay between God's love, human freedom, and the existence of suffering. This perspective challenges traditional interpretations of God's wrath, moving away from views that depict it as retributive punishment and instead framing it as God's nonviolent permission. God's wrath as permission. The theologian Brad Jersak articulates a transformative understanding of God's wrath, suggesting that it does not represent divine anger or retribution, but rather God's allowance for natural and spiritual laws to operate freely. This view posits that when destructive events occur, such as the death of the firstborn in Egypt or the fall of Jerusalem, these are not acts of divine intervention in anger, but rather reflections of God's consent to the consequences of human choices and actions, as noted in Romans 1 verses 24 to 28. By permitting such outcomes, God respects human agency even when those choices lead to suffering. This notion of consent emphasizes that God's love is not characterized by coercion or force, but is expressed through allowing creation to experience the ramifications of free will. Jersak highlights that such an understanding not only acknowledges the tragic reality of human existence, but also preserves the depth of divine love. The cross as a manifestation of divine consent. Jersak further elaborates that God's love is most profoundly revealed not by the elimination of suffering, but through God's active participation in that suffering, exemplified in the incarnation of Christ and his crucifixion. This idea aligns with the belief that God's consent to human suffering is ultimately redemptive. Through the cross, God fully enters into the human experience, affirming a love that coexists with suffering. The act of Christ's sacrifice serves as a profound statement that God's presence is with humanity in its darkest moments, providing solace and hope amid despair. This perspective resonates with theologians like Miroslav Volf, who argues that a theology of consent fosters a more compassionate understanding of God's relationship with humanity. Volf asserts that embracing God's participation in suffering encourages a deeper sense of empathy and connection between the divine and human experiences. Freedom, suffering, and love. The notion of divine consent invites a re-evaluation of the relationship between freedom and suffering. In allowing suffering to coexist with freedom, God creates an environment where love can truly flourish. Without the capacity for suffering, the depth and authenticity of love would be compromised. This concept echoes the thoughts of C.S. Lewis, who observed that pain often serves as a catalyst for spiritual growth and moral development. Moreover, this theological framework emphasizes that God's ultimate desire is for humanity to engage in genuine relationships characterized by love, trust, and mutual respect. By permitting suffering, God acknowledges the complexities of human existence and the necessity of authentic agency, even at the cost of pain and hardship. In conclusion, a theology of divine consent reframes traditional notions of God's wrath and love, suggesting that suffering is not merely a punishment inflicted by an angry deity, but a complex interplay of divine permission and human agency. This perspective affirms that while suffering is an intrinsic part of the human condition, God's presence through Christ offers redemption and hope. As Jersak suggests, divine consent allows love to emerge within the tragic realities of life, inviting believers to find meaning and connection even amid suffering.